Hey everybody, this is Brian, and I'm just kind of doing a recap here of some of the blog posts that I've written the last couple of months to go over some of the same material, but just in a video format here of why I'm choosing to build a Sling TSI and comparing that a little bit against certified airplanes as well as the RB10, which is probably its next closest competitor or airplane in the market. And just then a little bit of information about First Rivet and where the name came from. Uh, Building an airplane is a big project and actually really overwhelming if you look at it as a whole. Um, the idea behind the name First Rivet is this is a big project. It's going to start with putting the first rivet in the airplane and just plugging away rivet after rivet. That's sort of the idea behind the name there. Um, so first of all, comparing the TSI against certified airplanes, why would you not get a certified airplane? Certainly, there's some limitation to what the experimental market allows you to do. I'll probably go over that maybe in a future video, but let's look at this just from a material perspective or a performance perspective. We've got the SR20, which is Cirrus's base model, the Diamond DA40, and that's going to be the diesel engined category, and in the Cessna 182. They're all fairly comparable in size. The SR20 and the 182 both have a bigger cabin, so getting into them, you got more elbow room. You would think that a bigger person would be able to comfortably fit in there without too many issues. I have ridden in a Diamond, an older DA40 model, not a diesel one, but just a regular 100 low lead version. And I've actually found it a little cramped. The way the seats work and just the functional in the airplane, it just wasn't comfortable. And granted, it was an older airplane and it had a few thousand hours on it, but definitely not something that I'd feel comfortable, comfort-wise, riding in for a long period of time. The TSI I have flown, and it for the same 44 inches in width, cabin width there, I didn't feel cramped at all. I felt very comfortable. The seats were even the model that I was flying. It's the one that you see out of Torrance, California, and that one's got a bit of time on it. So you would think it would be kind of worn down by this point in time, but I still was like, man, I could ride in this for several hours easily. Comfort wise, the cabin width isn't too much of an issue, especially after having flown it. The empty weight on it, the Sling is obviously going to be the winner in this one at just a little over 1,000 pounds, with the SR20 being just the heaviest of the bunch. And keep in mind, I mean, the heavier the airplane, the more horsepower you're going to need to have a, a pure performance. So, and then the SR20 does also win in the max gross weight category. Um, but max gross doesn't necessarily mean it carries more. It just means that it's a heavier airplane. And if you look at it, the SR20 is only 13 pounds more than what the TSI is from a useful load perspective. So it's not that the Cirrus can carry more; it's just that it's heavier. So that's a kind of an interesting piece. Uh, Gas wise, here's one of the things that also to take into consideration when building or buying an airplane. What type of gas is being used? Diamond is moving into the market. I think Cirrus or Cessna is still working on a diesel derivative for their aircraft, because Jet A is a little bit little less expensive in most airports than 100 low lead. It's also a little bit more environmentally sound from an air or from a gas perspective. 100 low lead still contains lead. It's the only gas that's available for regular consumption that contains lead. For folks that may remember driving back as most recently as probably the early 90s, there was still regular gasoline which contained lead, and that's all been phased out at this point in time. The TSI, using a modern engine of the Rotax series, it can burn either 100 low lead or MoGas, which is effectively a 91, 92 octane that you would get at a regular gas station. So there are benefits of being able to run that Rotax engine. and it does burn a little bit less gas per hour or gallons per hour than either the Cirrus or the Cessna. It doesn't need to carry as much gas. Now, the diesel engine does show that it burns a little bit uh, less gas or gallons per hour than what the TSI does. Um, but then when we look at performance here, and I think it's in a few slides down on the performance, we get down to this, and it's only 6 knots faster at 60% fuel or 60% capacity. And I believe that TSI is burning or running at about 75% power at that level. So if we were to pull the power back even a little bit more, I mean, granted, we're going to go slower, but fuel burn wise, it's going to be similar. If we back up just a couple lines here, the few things that I was able to find basic investigation on the marketing material or the technical information that they put on as a per plane, uh, the uh, the takeoff distance there just seems a little unusually short. I suspect that that's probably more like 1,590 feet on the takeoff distance, but that's what I double checked that a couple times. So, but stall wise, I mean, they're all pretty similar. The Cirrus has got the highest one, and the with the flaps up and flaps down. So, range, the Cirrus is the shortest. I mean, it's the heaviest, so it doesn't have as much range. Everything else is within what 70 miles or so of the TSI. So, that's pretty reasonable when you're considering what's going on there. And then again, this is where things are a little bit weird. I don't know why the landing distance is so short, but it could have to do with the weight of the aircraft too. I don't think that these numbers are wildly off, and the weight of the aircraft certainly is going to have something to do with that. The service ceiling, again, keep in mind that the IO390, the Astro engine in the Diamond, and the Lycoming O-540 are all naturally aspirated engines, and that will be a reoccurring theme as we go along through this discussion. The Sling TSI, that's going to be an honest 18,000 feet. For those of you who watch a lot of YouTube, there's a couple of flights that the airplane factory out in California has taken their demo TSI up as high as 30,000 feet. It's kind of crazy. I can't in a million years imagine needing or wanting to take an airplane like that up to 30,000 feet, but certainly very doable. When you get into V&E or the never exceed speed, the SR20 definitely is going to beat out everything else. But um, when I flew the TSI out in Torrance last September, I found that even at sea level, when we climbed up to about 7,000 feet right off the airport, um, it really climbed or cruised fast up to 155 knots. I was shocked with how uh, fast it got to that point, and you kind of had to pay attention to that. In the flying time that I've been doing it, I haven't really experienced any other airplane where I've flown right up to the V&E speed with very little or having to really work hard to get it there. I'm not sure I'm quite saying that right. The V&E was something that I just never encountered, I should say, on the other airplanes. So it was a little surprising to see the airplane in the TSI get up to that 155 knots with absolutely no effort. This right here is the biggie. Um, TSI has this beat almost 2 to 1 on most cases here. Now, granted, that $190,000 cost is going to be lacking my time investing in building the airplane. I could write a check for the Cirrus Diamond or Cessna and have the plane delivered in whatever the time frame is. And this is for a new airplane. I think my time is well spent building something to have that. And then this is the other reason right here. Every single one of these airplanes, the Cirrus, the Diamond, the Cessna, beyond the owner and operator items that I can do as a pilot or an owner of an airplane, such as an oil change or changing a tire or brakes or something like that, I would have to pay an A&P to do that work. If I wanted to do an annual on an SR20, can't do it. I have to pay an A&P, and that's part of the regs. As an owner of an experimental airplane that I build, I will be able to do that annual. And that just basically means what I'm out is the time that it takes me to spend to do the annual itself, and then the material items that it would cost to do the annual. And certainly, if I have to call in an AMP to assist on it or something like that, I'm going to have to pay for that. But there's definitely a cost savings, especially over time, uh, in the long-term ownership of an experimental airplane. Why not buy a used airplane? Okay, well, I've been flying for 12 years or so at this point in time, and almost all but one. When I first started, I was in a light sport category aircraft, and that was a fairly new aircraft. Everything since then has been greater than 30 years old on anything that I've flown. Let's talk about comparing the TSI against a used aircraft. And I was out on a traded plane and I found an SR-20 in a 2003. So at this point in time, it's a 14-year-old airplane, which is still very new. Um, Purchase price, pretty decent, $200,000. And you don't want to buy an airplane, or you really shouldn't buy an airplane without a pre-purchase inspection. And again, that's something you need to have an A&P do. And it really should. Just somebody who's familiar with the platform, somebody who knows the ins and outs, somebody who knows what the struggles are on a particular platform. I think a $2,000 swag at something like that's pretty reasonable. So you're looking at just a little north of $200,000 for the acquisition costs. You're going to have to start up the operating expenses, your first annual. Anytime you buy a used airplane, there's a strong chance there's a lot of deferred maintenance on the airplane. One of the reasons why people will be getting out of the airplane, because they're looking at deferred maintenance of some type that is going to set you back. I think $3,000 is fairly conservative when it comes to a first annual. I have heard of scenarios of Cirrus owners of their annual brand new ones where it was $10,000 and nothing was found wrong. And this is many years ago, so I'm erring on the side of caution from a low number, but it's still pretty conservative, I think. Base reserves, well, you're buying the airplane, so you're not going to really have any cash reserves behind the airplane. You're going to have to register it, 150 bucks. Probably set up an LLC just to put it in with a company. In this particular case, I'm not putting down any avionics upgrades. This particular 2003 Cirrus was pretty rare. The avionics were in Aspen. It probably had a 430 in it, and there was enough modern avionics in this that I would be comfortable with. Um, Most used certified airplanes don't have that. I found most of these certified airplanes require some type of upgrade, or something to bring it up to speed with some more modern avionics. So I think that 4100 is a very solid number. So you're still looking at about $205,000. Got some fixed costs. How much is it going to cost on a regular basis? Insurance. The Cirrus is definitely a proven airplane. Insurance companies probably aren't going to balk too much at it. The hangar tie down, that's going to be exactly the same whether you're buying new, used, experimental, doesn't matter. And quite frankly, if I'm going to spend in the category of $200,000 on an airplane, I'm just not somebody who would want to leave that airplane outside in the elements, so it'll definitely be hangared. Here's where the annual inspection is going to come into play. Probably out of budget about $4,000 a year. So you're probably looking at about $11,000 or so annually, or if you're looking at your monthly costs, probably around $1,000 a month. How's that compared to the TSI? The purchase price, that $190,000. Now, keep in mind that is not. I'm writing a check for $190,000 and I get the airplane. That is, I'll break those costs down when we compare this against the RB10. But this cost is broken down over a period of time. Pre-purchase inspection, I tossed in 500 bucks there for something like the designated airworthiness inspector that needs to come out and check on the airplane. Maybe some other incidentals that go along with that. It's going to be around $190,000 for the purchase. Startup costs. This is a brand new airplane. You built it. There's not going to be any deferred maintenance that needs to go on with it. And I think 500 bucks is probably pretty generous. You may have some materials that you'd have to buy, oil changes, maybe some tires or whatnot, but there really shouldn't be that much in theory. Again, you're also starting out with base reserves. Registration is going to be the same. LLC is going to be the same. Avionics, well, if you're building the airplane, you better build it with the avionics that you're expecting to have. Peer for peer, you're coming in quite a bit less first startup there. So, you're probably looking at a little bit south of what the total startup costs are. But again, this is not, I'm writing a $190,000 check and getting an airplane. This is over the course of time of building it too. Fixed costs. This is where we have some problems. The Sling TSI is a fairly new, well, the TSI is a new platform. It was initially came out in 2018. It's based on the Sling 4 platform, but it's got a different wing and a little bit bigger engine. Insurance companies, especially right now, they are gun shy of aviation, in my opinion, general. They basically are jacking the rates up everywhere, and the fact that there's not a lot of these flying, insurance costs I've heard as high as $8,000, but I've seen $5,000 on a pretty regular basis. At this point in time, I'm a little north of 700 hours commercial rated pilot, and that was right about the quote that I got. This twice of what the Cirrus is. That definitely hurts. Insurance, or I'm sorry, hangars and tie down are going to be equal. Annual inspection. This is where you're going to beat it. Now, keep in mind the SR20, that annual inspection potentially could be $4,000 every year. That annual inspection for the TSI, it's all you, because I own the airplane and I built the airplane. I am able to do the inspection. So $800 in materials, that's effectively what it comes down to. My fixed costs are going to be slightly less. Now, and here's the thing, the insurance isn't going to always be $5,000. That's going to come down over time because as more of these start flying, there's going to be more of them proven in the air. And more people because there's more flying, the insurance companies are just going to have spread their risk out or have a better understanding of what the risk is with the airplane. I don't expect that $5,000 to stay stagnant. I expect that to come down, and that's just based off of other experiences of other experimental planes that have come onto the market. So that $10,600 will slowly come down over time. Hangar and tie down probably will go up. Costs of materials for the annual inspections probably go up. So, but those are going to be equal across the board, no matter which airplane you're flying. At that point in time, the experimental's still going to beat, and experimental's going to beat it out. The Cirrus is a 14-year-old airplane. It's going to have a greater amount of maintenance as time goes by. All right, so we've looked at the costs for purchasing the Cirrus, and let's look at what the operational costs are and compare those two. Hourly hour fuel burn about 11.5 gallons an hour. It's running 100 low lead, so $4 a gallon. I think that's probably a pretty safe bet at this point in time. There's going to be some higher, some lower, but a good average there. Burns probably 0.2 of a quart per hour. $8 per quart. Okay, this is why that Cirrus was that much, or that little, I should say. In this particular case, there is a pending potential engine change. 1600 TBO, or time between overhaul. That's when the manufacturer recommendation is for doing an overhaul on the engine. This is not a hard and fast rule. There's no regulation that says, oh, you hit 1600 hours, you must have that engine rebuilt. It is a manufacturer recommended time frame. There's a number of videos that are out there or in documentation that goes over this, so I won't really belabor that. But it just basically means that in about 96 hours, there's a potential that you may be looking at overhaul. So that has to be taken into consideration when you're purchasing something like this. Probably looking at about $40,000 or so for an engine overhaul. Prop is about the same. Well, guess what? In this lifespan of this particular airplane, the 14-year-old airplane, it's been flying just around a little over 100 hours a year based on 14 years and 1,500 hours of time that's been actually used in the airplane. Proper overhaul is going to cost some money. And then you've got your your oil change every 50 hours or so. Your oil change cost is going to be $65, assuming you do it yourself. It is a certified airplane, so you may be, okay, I've just got to have somebody do it for me. 100-hour inspection. because this is a certified airplane, I could put this airplane out for rent or for lease. There's a number of flight schools. They typically will take in airplanes similar to this and put them on the flight line for students to learn on. If that's that type of operation, you will be definitely looking at a $100 inspection. But again, if you're leasing the airplane out or to a flight school, in theory, making some money with the airplane, so that cost should be uh, taken care of. If we look at this for the operational costs, we've got a wet rate and a dry rate. Dry rate would be as if you're renting it out to somebody and you don't necessarily want to pay for fuel on that. The wet rate would be this is what your cost is, and you don't tend to worry about what the cost of the pump is. Dry rate just means that, whoever's flying it's on the hook for the gas. In this particular case, we'll stick with the wet rate because that's what I would be paying if I was the owner of the airplane. So figure about $46 per hour just for the fuel burn, and oil change about $1.60, oil change $2.60, engine overhaul. Why is that so high? Well, in theory, you would want to put money aside in reserves for the potential or looming overhaul that's coming up. Now, this is a literal interpretation at this point in time that there's 96 hours left. It's $40,000 for the overhaul. Take $40,000 divided by 96, and that gives us our $416,000. That would be as if you wanted to make sure you had $40,000 in the bank at the time that you hit 1600. Now, if you were to buy this airplane, you potentially would say, well, I'm going to hold some money back from the overall cost of the airplane. I would have that money available if the engine were needing to be having an overhaul. It doesn't mean you would have to have the overhaul done at 1600. It just means that there's potential that you would have to have it done. There's plenty of airplanes that are on the market that are past TBO, and compression still looking good. The oil analysis is still coming back looking good. There's no real demand for the engine to be overhauled at that time, but it could happen at any point in time. Proper overhaul, very similar scenario. Would want to have that overhauled at 1600 with the engine. About $42 per hour you need to put in. General maintenance, just a slush fund for various things, the tire changes and whatnot. I mean, you got an exaggerated wet rate of a little over $528 per hour to fly the airplane. Now, if you were to buy our lower time airframe, lower time engine, then you wouldn't have such a high hourly wet rate. If you decided, okay, fine, I'm going to buy the airplane and do the immediate overhaul. Okay, well, that's great. That resets that clock, but that $200,000 to buy the airplane all of a sudden turns into a $240,000 purchase. So now we're well outside the scope of what the overall cost of the Sling TSI is. Just some variables that I always have to kind of be looking at when you're looking at a used airplane. And again, you've got a 14-year-old airplane that you'd be looking at spending $240,000 on. TSI, build brand new. Let's look at this cost here. Figure it burns about $8 or 8 gallons per hour, so it's about 3 gallons less per hour, and it burns MoGas. Now, MoGas, definitely lots of information out there on the internet on that. It's basically 91, 92 octane that you would find at any gas station. The main difference is that in the gas station fuel, they typically put ethanol in it. The ethanol can be a problem if you leave it sitting in a Rotax engine for a period of time. If you go out to the airplane factory where the TSI is sold through, they've got the Sling Academy where they have students going through that at a regular clip. And they've got several 2 and 4 seat Sling aircraft, and they're all running Rotax 912, 914 engines in them. When you ask them, it's like, where do you get your fuel from? They go, oh, well, we've got a truck over here and we just go over to Costco and we just fill it up. So they are using out of the gas pump the 92 octane gas because their airplanes are flying all the time. And they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of hours on those Rotax engines, and they have not had a problem with them. So it stands to reason that you should be able to run this without any problem whatsoever, just the regular 91, 92 octane at the gas station. I don't really see a problem doing something like that. Should I say, okay, fine, I'm not comfortable with running the Costco gas. All I got to do is go find an airport that has MoGas, or I can get external fuel tanks, put them in the back of my truck, buy the non-ethanol MoGas, and then just truck it over the airport and fill it up there. That's great for if I'm flying locally, which is, a majority of my flying. If I'm going cross country, then I've got a different scenario where my flight planning might involve finding airports that have MoGas on the field, maybe flying a little bit more out of my way. Who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, it still runs 100 low lead. What does that mean? That just basically means that I've got to do an oil change every 25 hours instead of 50 hours. So I've got a little bit extra cost if I'm flying cross country, and I've got to go with 100 low lead, but it's not a deal breaker from this particular perspective. The Rotax burns oil a little bit differently than what the Lycomings do. It's a self-contained system. I was just mentioning the other day that I was a partner in a different light sport aircraft that ran a 912 engine, and it was white. And in the couple hundred hours that I flew that particular airplane, I never once remember cleaning the belly of that airplane. And you would think a white airplane would have as much residue underneath it as, say, like a Piper Cherokee or a Saratoga or something like that. I've cleaned many of those bellies because they're just completely dirty with the lead deposits that come off of the engine. It doesn't burn as much oil based on that information. Again, pure for pure, 8 quarts per hour. It's going to be a brand new engine, so there's going to be tons of time on it. Still going to be about the $40,000 overhaul. Prop, same thing. So we go on down. Oil change, figure out every 50 hours. Oil change, we'll just call it a wash there because it's experimental. I won't be able to do a lease back on this. That's fine. I'm building this airplane for me. It's not for rent. It's not something that I'm going to plan on hiring out on that type of an operation. Fuel burn. Let's say if I'm burning MoGas, I'm certainly going to be spending less per gallon on my wet rate. Oil change doesn't burn as much. Oil change is going to be about the same. My engine overhaul, I've got 2,000 hours before I've got to replace that engine. And one thing I did miss, that 2,000 hours. If you were to go out and look at Rotax's documentation for the 915 at this stage of the game, February 2021, their documentation will say a 1,400 hour TBO on the engine. So why do I have 2,000? When I first started flying, the 912 was their most modern engine, and their TBO was 1,400 hours. While I was in the ownership in the light sport airplane, Rotax issued a letter that said these serial number engines now have a TBO of 2,000. And the reason is because Rotax will initially do an early TBO on their new engines, and the 915 is a fairly new engine from the Rotax factory. I would expect, and I think that's a fairly safe bet because they've done this with the 912 and the 914, that somewhere in the next year or two they will issue that type of change to their engine. Talked to a number of people. They all agree that this is a pending change that is coming down the line. They just don't know when. Because what they need is they need a sample that's been out in the field and working on that. The engine that is on the demo plane in California, I think it's got 1,300 hours, something like that. So it's going to be coming up on that 1,400 hours. They're going to do a full core swap, engine for engine on that TSI, and they'll take that airplane, that engine back to the factory. They'll inspect it, and at that point in time, we'll probably see some type of change come from Rotax. 2,000 hours is a fairly safe bet. Prop overhaul, again, it's a fresh prop, and we'll toss in the same $20. $72 an hour figure. If I'm going to be putting money into reserves and everything like that when I'm flying the airplane. And again, I don't see anybody going out and buying a Cirrus that's got the time on the engine like that and being able to put away the $450 per hour to catch up that $40,000. If they were to go out and buy that Cirrus and not have adequate cash reserves, they could be looking at not being able to fly their airplane because they don't have enough money to be able to buy that. Or I'm sorry, to be able to do the overhaul on the engine. I mean, that's fairly realistic. You're looking at you can't spend all the money that you have on getting the Cirrus and with that kind of an engine. And you do this yourself. Go to trade a plane. Look at every single one of these airplanes. Does it have the avionics that you want in it? Does it have paint? Does it have interior? Does it have the engine? All those pieces have to be weighed when you're looking at buying a used airplane because at some point in time those things are going to need to be addressed. All right. So moving along. So let's compare this against an RV10. And I want to preface this. This is not meant to be a dig or something against the RV10. Every RV10 that I've looked at, and an RV in general, they are very nice airplanes. Um, I looked at my mission. I looked at what I had time to build, what I what I wanted to have. The TSI is the airplane that I chose for my mission. The RV10, there are valid reasons to have that type of an airplane and investing the time in the build. This is just a peer-for-peer comparison for this exercise here. These prices are all based off of the information that I was able to find on the respective websites, the RV10s and the Slings side. The empennage is the first thing that you get. Slings get a little bit less expensive. Wings, the RV10 is a little less expensive. Just kind of balancing things out here. The RV10 is a little bit more expensive. Undercarriage is interesting because I couldn't find any documentation for an undercarriage from the RV10, so I'm assuming that that is part of the canopy and finishing side of things. Even so, it still comes out to be pretty close to what the or a little bit more expensive than what the TSI is. But at the end of the day, our avionics are going to be about the same. The engine, I think the numbers on this, the TSI is a little bit more than what I expected them to be. But again, this is sort of based on the information that I was able to find. When it all comes down to it, the RV10 actually is slightly less expensive. Yeah, okay. $14,000 less expensive, something like that. And the quick build cost is less expensive. One thing to also note is that the RV10 is going to have a ton of aftermarket stuff that's out there beyond what the RV factory has. The TSI, being a relatively new airplane, isn't going to have as much third-party products on the market. But this is really where I was like, I think I'd rather spend a little bit more money on the TSI and get this done sooner. 1,400-hour estimated build time. Now, granted, that's somebody sitting down and kind of taking a big old swag at how long do you think it'd take somebody who's never built an airplane to build? About 1,400 hours. It could take me every bit of 2,000 hours to build my TSI. I'm hoping not. But the difference in that 600 hours is that the build is different. The TSI uses pulled rivets. The RV10 uses buck rivets. And what that means is the buck rivet needs another person involved during that build process. And that's going to be coordinating time with the other person, getting them to the wherever you're building at. TSI is just basically you put the rivet in, you pull it. You don't have to depend on somebody else to be there. The quick build time is even less. All right, so let's look at the performance differences. Right off the bat, take a look at the top there. Like the RV10 has a recommended or an up to the Lycoming O-540, 260 horsepower. um, it can run smaller engines. I actually encountered an RV10 the other day that was running a turbo Subaru engine in it, which was very interesting. But I think it's like about a 200 horsepower engine. Lengthwise, wingspan wise, they're about the same. Wing loading, the RV10 can carry a little bit more. Cabin width, RV10 is definitely going to be a little bit more roomy, no question about it. In fact, one thing that's really interesting is if you're not really familiar with what you're looking at, it's easy to mistake an RV10 for a Cirrus on the ramp. I've done it. You look at it, and you're like, that's a funny looking Cirrus. And then you get a little closer and you realize, okay, it's an RV10. This is an important line here, this empty weight. There's a 600-pound difference between the RV10 and the TSI. Sort of explains why you need a bigger engine because you've got 600 more pounds to move. Your max gross weight, again, it just follows that trend. Useful load, they're almost the same. Gas wise, now that 540 is going to drink a lot of gas. So 15 more gallons is probably not a good peer relationship. So it makes it kind of interesting. Takeoff distance, the RV10 is certainly going to beat it there. The rate of climb, now this is from sea level. Keep in mind, there's going to be some times I'm going to point some of this stuff out. It's got a pretty generous climb rate. I mean, 2,000 feet per minute is a pretty good climb. But 1,000 foot per minute is no slouch either. Little bit slower stall speed for the TSI, a little bit staller with the flaps down. Line distance, I'm sorry, the max cruise speed. The RV10, and this is again a sea level performance, 181 knots with that particular engine. Yeah, it's almost 30 knots faster. So that's definitely going to be a difference there. Landing, the TSI, again, it's a lighter airplane, so it's probably going to take less space. A little higher service ceiling for what the RV10 has. The V&E on this is 200 knots for the RV10, 155 for the TSI. We go over and we took a look at the efficiency comparison here. We're going to be burning less gas per hour. Range wise, though, you're going to have to run at about 75% of the power, getting about 25 more nautical miles than the TSI. Your cruise speed's about 170 knots at 8,000 feet. And this is going to be an important point that I'm going to make here. And this is one of the other reasons why I went with the TSI. If I go to 16,000 feet, why is the RV10 slower? Well, keep in mind that Lycoming engine is naturally aspirated. I'll go into that in the next slide deck here. The TSI is going to maintain full power all the way up to 16,000 feet. So I should still be seeing 145 knots at that altitude. On the 8 gallons per hour, I've got about a 7-hour endurance in that. Why is the TSI going to be faster at 16,000 feet than at 8,000 feet? Certainly, the RV10 is going to beat it at 8,000 feet. This is also a consideration when I'm building this, or why I went this route. I live in Colorado. Anytime I want to go west, I'm going to be looking at least at 12, 13,000 feet at minimum to get over the initial front range with the a safe variable over the mountaintop there. So if you read the bullet line there at the top, as a general rule, a naturally aspirated combustion engine will lose 3% of its power for every 1,000 feet of elevation gain. So in other words, if you have 100 horsepower at sea level, by the time you get to 5,000 feet of elevation, your engine is making 85 horsepower. So you're losing 15 horsepower in that 5,000 feet of altitude. If we're looking at sea level, or 1,000 feet, the TSI certainly is not going to have as much horsepower, roughly 135 horsepower. And keep in mind, the turbo is going to be developing full horsepower. Now, I put the turbo point at 135 because that 140 horsepower is only good for 5 minutes. So I'm just saying, okay, fine, I'll toss that 5 minutes out, and I'm just going to go with the normal running horsepower is. 1,000 feet, I haven't lost much. And remember, there's a 600 pounds difference between the TSI and the RV10. If we jump to 8,000 feet, the difference between the TSI engine and the Lycoming is going to be 68 horsepower difference. I'm only developing about 200 horsepower at 8,000 feet in the RV10. 10,000 feet at elevation, the engine will make 70 horsepower. Now that's as per the note from above. That's not referencing the Lycoming engine. That's just saying your 100 horsepower engine is now making only 70 horsepower. Let's jump to 10,000 feet. My Lycoming in the RV10 is dropped to 191 horsepower. I'm still developing 135 horsepower, and I'm now only 56 horsepower difference between the two. 12,000 feet. Let's go ahead and just say, okay, fine. 15,000 feet, that same 100 horsepower engine is now only making 55 horsepower. The TSI, or the Rotax 915 turbo, is good for full horsepower up to 15,000 feet. Now I'm only 30 horsepower difference between the RV10 and the TSI. Keep in mind, there's a 600 pounds difference between the two. Does that 30 horsepower difference propel the RV10 that much faster than what the TSI would be if it's developing full horsepower at 15,000 feet? Keep going here and see how it is. Now we start seeing the TSI horsepower start dropping off above 16,000 feet because it's no longer able to maintain full horsepower beyond that, because we start getting above what the turbo can actually compensate for. But it's still going to be developing a little bit more horsepower, and you can see the trend it's slowing. But at 19,000 feet now, granted 19,000 feet is pretty crazy for just a normal GA airplane, but it's only 22 horsepower different. And we got 20,000, and we just keep on going. Oh, we'll just go all the way up to 24,000 feet. Up to 24,000 feet, I've only lost 30 horsepower on the TSI, whereas I've lost 134 horsepower on the RV10. That's a big difference, especially when we're talking it has to move around 600 more horsepower. This is from Savvy Aviator, hosts a regular podcast for that. Very, very good podcast. Speaks a lot about airframe systems. This is just one of the slide decks that I actually borrowed from there. Basically says here, normally aspirated airplane likes to fly at 8,000 feet in MSL. They get slower as they get higher, as they climb above that altitude. Turbos, they just keep going faster as they climb higher, up to critical altitude of typically 16,000, which is what the TSI is, up to 24,000 feet. To me, it's one of those things where the TSI seems to have an edge when you're flying at altitude. This is just a bar graph here that basically goes over the loss of power over altitude climb. The difference in horsepower with the bar on the far left-hand side is 125 horsepower difference between the Lycoming, the I-O-540, and the TSI, the 915 TSI, up to about 16,000 feet. And you can see then it starts kind of leveling out about that. Now, all of a sudden, that 600-pound weight difference makes a pretty big deal. This is just the sources down below. Van's Aircraft actually supplies this information on their website. Garrett Motion, which is no relation to me, has a good turbocharging information on their website, and then the basic information for Rotax 915 site, and then the Lycoming site. Which one's better? Again, that's just going to really depend on the personal preference and the mission. If I lived at sea level or 1,000 feet AGL, and I probably didn't have to worry too much about altitude too much, I probably would be more inclined to do an RV10. But given the fact that I can go out to an airport on a nice summer day and it's 80 degrees out, my density altitude is already going to be about 9,000 feet. Takeoff rows will be longer. My climb performance is going to be really impacted. And anything westbound is going to be sort of questionable at 80 degrees at the front range airports. Sling TSI's got a faster build that should be able to match the performance of the RV10 at altitude. I don't really see that there's too much of a difference, but the mission for me, the TSI tends to be a little bit better, and that's definitely what I'm looking forward to being able to build. So that's just kind of the, the method behind the madness and how I arrived at this decision. Hopefully you found this information helpful. Thanks.